The jungle was supposed to protect them. Dense leaves. Heavy shade. A green wall that swallowed sound and sight. But in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers discovered a new terror. The forest did not hide them. It betrayed them. Somewhere in the shadows, American snipers were already set, watching gaps in the canopy, measuring silence, waiting for motion. If you want to understand how fear itself became a weapon, stay with this story, and subscribe now. By the time American forces pushed deeper into the Pacific in 1942, the war had already taken on a character unlike anything seen in Europe or North Africa. This was not a conflict of open fields or visible front lines. It was a war fought in humidity, shadow, and uncertainty. The jungle dominated everything. It swallowed roads, erased horizons, and reduced visibility to a matter of steps rather than distance. For soldiers on both sides, survival depended not just on weapons, but on adaptation. Japanese military doctrine had long emphasized movement, concealment, and psychological pressure. Infantry units were trained to use terrain aggressively, slipping through vegetation, approaching silently, and striking from unexpected angles. Dense forests were considered a natural ally. Thick foliage masked advance. Dark canopy broke silhouettes. The jungle, it was believed, neutralized technologically superior enemies by denying them sight and space. Early Pacific engagements seemed to confirm this belief. In places like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, American units initially struggled. Patrols disappeared into greenery and returned bloodied or not at all. Sound traveled unpredictably. Rain erased tracks. Even experienced officers found it difficult to determine where the enemy was, or if he was watching from only a few meters away. Japanese troops moved confidently under cover of leaves and vines, convinced that concealment itself offered protection. But the jungle was not neutral. It punished assumptions. And as the war progressed, American commanders began to understand something fundamental. Dense terrain did not belong to the side that moved through it the fastest, it belonged to the side that controlled it the longest. The U.S. military entered the Pacific with a doctrine shaped by range, firepower, and coordination. At first glance, those advantages seemed blunted by vegetation. Rifles could not see far. Artillery targets vanished behind trees. Even aircraft struggled to identify positions beneath the canopy. Yet these limitations forced a reassessment rather than a retreat. The jungle was not an obstacle to be avoided. It was a system to be studied. American units began mapping patterns instead of distances. They noted where light broke through leaves at certain times of day. They studied how movement disturbed foliage. They observed how sound behaved after rainfall. Slowly, methodically, they learned that forests created predictability. Trails formed naturally. Clearings repeated themselves. Men seeking concealment followed the same paths again and again. At the same time, the U.S. military possessed a deep institutional advantage, the ability to adapt at scale. Training manuals were revised. Field reports were circulated. Lessons learned in one campaign reached units preparing for the next. What began as improvisation hardened into doctrine. Nowhere was this transformation more significant than in the emerging use of snipers. Before the Pacific War, American sniper doctrine was limited and uneven. But the jungle changed the equation. Short sight lines did not eliminate precision, they concentrated it. Shots were no longer taken at long distances. They were taken at decisive moments. When a head appeared through leaves. When a shoulder shifted. When a silhouette paused, believing it was unseen. Japanese soldiers continued to trust the forest. They moved low. They hugged trunks. They advanced under shade. But they did not realize that the jungle, once mapped and understood, offered something else entirely: funnels. Points where movement was unavoidable. Where vegetation forced bodies into narrow lines. Where even the most careful step created sound, motion, and exposure. As American forces consolidated their understanding of jungle warfare, a quiet imbalance emerged. Japanese units still believed concealment guaranteed safety. American units began to believe patience guaranteed control. One side relied on movement. The other relied on stillness. And in the dense forest shade, stillness began to win. That realization would soon transform the jungle from a shield into a trap, a shift that became impossible for Japanese soldiers to ignore. For Japanese infantrymen, the jungle was never meant to be feared. It was meant to be mastered. Long before the Pacific War began, Imperial Japanese Army training emphasized endurance, stealth, and aggressive maneuver. Soldiers were conditioned to move where visibility was poor and contact sudden. Dense terrain was not considered a limitation, it was an advantage that rewarded discipline and punished hesitation. Japanese doctrine favored infiltration over firepower. Units were trained to advance through cover, bypass strongpoints, and appear where the enemy least expected them. Jungle vegetation seemed ideal for this approach. It muffled sound. It obscured numbers. It allowed small groups to move independently, striking supply lines or flanks before melting back into foliage. In theory, this environment reduced the effectiveness of industrial firepower and turned combat into a contest of will. This belief shaped behavior on the ground. Japanese patrols moved frequently. Positions were shifted often. Soldiers trusted darkness and shade to erase their outlines. They believed that if they could not see the enemy could not see them either. The forest created a sense of invisibility, and with it, confidence. But that confidence rested on a fragile assumption that concealment and protection were the same thing. In reality, jungle terrain imposed strict limits on human movement. Thick undergrowth funneled men along game trails and narrow clearings. Roots and vines slowed progress. Equipment snagged. Even the most disciplined soldier could not advance without disturbing leaves, branches, or soil. Movement created patterns, and patterns could be learned. Japanese doctrine emphasized constant pressure. Units were encouraged to probe, harass, and advance whenever possible. Stillness was often associated with passivity. To stop moving was to lose initiative. But in the jungle, this instinct became a liability. Each step, however careful, announced presence. Each pause under shade created a silhouette against filtered light. American forces began to observe this contradiction. Japanese soldiers were skilled, resilient, and brave, but predictable. They relied on the jungle as a cloak, not realizing it acted more like a lens. Light filtered through the canopy in consistent ways. Certain hours of the day illuminated specific angles. Shadows did not fall randomly. They repeated themselves. Japanese units also faced structural constraints. Their doctrine placed less emphasis on individual marksmanship at range. Rifles were effective, but optics were rare. Precision fire from concealed positions was not prioritized to the same degree. Instead, success depended on coordinated movement, surprise, and momentum. When that momentum stalled, options narrowed quickly. As American snipers and observers settled into overwatch positions, Japanese movement began to draw fire with unnerving regularity. A soldier stepping out to relay a message. Another adjusting a pack strap. A third crouching beneath a tree, convinced the shade hit him completely. Shots came without warning, not in volleys, not in chaos, but singly, deliberately, and decisively. At first, these losses were interpreted as bad luck. Or coincidence. Jungle warfare was expected to be unpredictable. But as days passed, a pattern emerged. Casualties occurred during movement. Stillness seemed safer. Units began delaying advances. Patrols paused longer than planned. Orders were executed with hesitation. This ran directly against Japanese doctrine. The jungle was meant to enable action, not discourage it. Yet the environment was no longer behaving as expected. It was no longer neutral ground. It had become a contested system, one increasingly dominated by an enemy that did not rush, did not probe, and did not reveal itself. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship and fear. But fear without a visible source was different. It eroded confidence silently. It made every shadow suspect. Every rustle threatening. The jungle, once trusted, now felt hostile. What Japanese doctrine could not account for was an enemy willing to wait longer, observe more carefully, and fire less often, but with devastating effect. And as this realization spread through the ranks, the balance between movement and survival began to shift, setting the stage for an American adaptation that would redefine jungle combat entirely. That adaptation would turn patience into dominance, and observation into a weapon, a transformation that began quietly, long before the first decisive engagement. American forces did not arrive in the Pacific as masters of jungle warfare. Their early encounters made that clear. Dense vegetation disrupted formations. Visibility collapsed. Traditional advantages in firepower and coordination seemed blunted by leaves and mud. But the U.S. military possessed something its enemy could not match at scale, a system built to absorb lessons, refine them, and apply them relentlessly. Adaptation began at the smallest level. Platoons adjusted how they moved. Patrols slowed. Observation replaced speed. Men learned to stop thinking in terms of distance and start thinking in terms of time. How long a position could be watched without movement? How long a trail remained unused before becoming suspicious? The jungle, once chaotic, began to reveal structure. Out of this shift emerged a renewed emphasis on marksmanship and overwatch. American commanders recognized that the jungle compressed combat into moments. Engagements were brief, sudden, and decisive. In such conditions, volume of fire mattered less than precision. A single accurate shot at the right moment could halt an advance more effectively than sustained gunfire. Sniper employment evolved accordingly. Rather than acting as lone hunters, American snipers were increasingly integrated into unit tactics. They were positioned along likely movement corridors, narrow trails, stream crossings, gaps in undergrowth where men were forced to slow or expose themselves. These positions were not chosen for range, but for inevitability. The enemy would pass through them sooner or later. Training reinforced this philosophy. Patience was elevated from a personal virtue to a tactical requirement. Snipers learned to observe without firing, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. They studied how light filtered through canopy at different times. How rain darkened leaves and altered contrast. How steam rising from wet ground revealed movement. The jungle became a readable surface, not an impenetrable wall. Equipment choices reflected this adaptation. Rifles were selected for reliability in humidity. Optics were kept simple, durable, and practical. Camouflage was improvised and refined, not decorative but functional. American snipers blended into tree roots, fallen logs, and natural depressions, becoming part of the terrain itself. They did not chase the enemy. They waited for him. This approach contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized initiative through movement, American doctrine increasingly emphasized control through observation. Where one side sought advantage by advancing unseen, the other sought dominance by seeing everything. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. Japanese soldiers could no longer trust the jungle as a shield. The absence of visible American forces did not indicate safety, it suggested surveillance. Each pause under cover carried risk. Each attempt to reposition invited exposure. Movement itself became the trigger. American units reinforced this effect deliberately. Snipers fired sparingly. They avoided revealing positions. Shots were timed to moments of maximum consequence, when a unit leader moved, when a patrol emerged from cover, when hesitation could spread fastest. The goal was not simply to kill, but to disrupt rhythm. To force delay. To make the enemy question every step. Reports from the field reflected this change. Japanese units slowed. Patrols shortened. Aggressive probing gave way to cautious pauses. The jungle, once a place of confidence, now imposed constant mental strain. American dominance did not come from overwhelming presence, but from absence, from the sense that unseen eyes were always watching. What made this adaptation decisive was its scalability. Lessons learned by one unit were transmitted across the theater. Training programs adjusted. New snipers were trained with jungle conditions in mind from the outset. What began as field improvisation hardened into doctrine. By the time later campaigns unfolded, American forces no longer entered the jungle expecting surprise. They entered expecting observation. They did not rush to engage. They settled in, mapped movement, and waited. And as this method matured, Japanese soldiers would face a battlefield where the forest itself seemed hostile, a place where stillness belonged to the Americans, and movement invited consequences that could not be escaped. That growing imbalance would soon reveal itself not just tactically, but psychologically, as fear began to spread through the jungle faster than any patrol ever could. The fear that spread through Japanese units in the jungle did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, moment by moment, shaped by absence rather than chaos. There were no warning barrages. No visible enemy lines. Only the growing realization that the forest was no longer empty, it was occupied by something unseen. From a human perspective, this was a uniquely corrosive kind of terror. Soldiers were trained to face danger they could identify. A charge. An ambush. Incoming fire. But the jungle sniper erased those reference points. Death came without sound beyond the shot itself. Often, there was no direction to return fire toward. A man would fall, and the forest would return to silence. The absence of an enemy became more frightening than his presence. This silence attacked morale directly. Japanese infantry relied heavily on cohesion and momentum. Units advanced together. Confidence came from movement and proximity. But sniper fire fractured that rhythm. A single loss halted progress. Men froze, scanning trees that offered no answers. Orders slowed. Leaders hesitated, aware that standing to signal or shout invited exposure. Command itself became dangerous. Tactically, the jungle amplified this effect. Dense foliage limited fields of view to narrow tunnels of visibility. American snipers exploited this by controlling specific angles rather than wide areas. They did not need to dominate the forest, only the places where movement became unavoidable. Trails, clearings, creek beds, fallen trees. Each became a potential point of decision, where a soldier had to choose between advancing and waiting. Waiting, however, carried its own cost. Stillness bred uncertainty. The longer a unit paused, the more tension built. Every sound, a bird, a shifting branch, dripping water, demanded attention. Fatigue set in quickly. Muscles tightened. Focus narrowed. The jungle pressed inward, turning time itself into a weapon. Environmentally, the forest favored the observer over the mover. Light filtered through canopy in predictable patterns. Sunlight created contrasts between shadow and motion. A body-shifting weight disturbed leaves in ways that stood out to a trained eye. Even breath could be visible in cooler hours. American snipers learned to read these signs instinctively, often without conscious thought. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, struggled to adapt. Attempts to counter sniper fire often revealed positions further. Suppressive fire into trees wasted ammunition and achieved little. Aggressive charges risked immediate losses. Digging in offered temporary relief, but immobilized units were vulnerable to encirclement. Every response seemed to carry consequence. Leadership faced impossible choices. Move and risk losses. Stop and lose initiative. Withdraw and concede ground. The jungle allowed no easy solutions. American forces, by contrast, dictated tempo without revealing themselves. They chose when contact occurred, and when it did not. Over time, this imbalance reshaped behavior. Japanese patrols shortened routes. Units delayed movements until darkness, only to discover that reduced visibility helped the sniper as much as the target. Men began avoiding certain trails altogether, funneling themselves into fewer options, exactly what American observers anticipated. Fear spread through observation rather than rumor. Soldiers watched comrades fall. They noticed patterns. Certain areas became associated with loss. The jungle acquired memory. Places where nothing appeared different became places no one wanted to cross. The forest itself felt hostile, as if aligned against them. American snipers did not need to increase fire to deepen this effect. In fact, restraint amplified it. Long periods without contact bred anxiety. When shots finally came, they confirmed the worst suspicion, that surveillance never stopped. The enemy was not gone. He was waiting. This convergence of human fear, tactical precision, and environmental mastery produced something rare in warfare: dominance without constant engagement. Japanese soldiers were not overwhelmed by numbers or firepower. They were constrained, slowed, pressured inward by terrain they once trusted. And as this pressure mounted, there would come moments when movement was no longer just dangerous, it was impossible, forcing confrontations that would define the turning point of jungle warfare. Those moments would arrive when hesitation met necessity, and the forest demanded a decision that could no longer be delayed. By mid-campaign, the jungle had ceased to be a place of maneuver for Japanese forces. It had become a maze of risks, each path weighted with consequence. Orders still came. Objectives still existed. But executing them required movement, and movement had become the most dangerous act a soldier could perform. American units understood this shift. They did not seek decisive engagements through massed assaults. Instead, they applied pressure patiently, shaping the battlefield long before contact occurred. Snipers were positioned days in advance. Observation posts were established overlooking key trails and natural choke points. The forest was studied not as terrain, but as behavior, how men moved through it when they believed they were unseen. The climax of this transformation unfolded during sustained jungle engagements where Japanese units attempted to reposition under cover of foliage. Patrols advanced cautiously, spacing widened, communication minimized. Yet the moment movement became necessary, a signal passed, a formation adjusted, a flank corrected, the jungle responded. Shots arrived without warning. Precise. Singular. A soldier collapsed. Another froze. The unit halted instinctively, scanning a wall of green that offered no answers. Return fire erupted briefly, wild and unfocused, then stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. Each pause compounded the problem. Delays exposed units to further observation. The longer men remained in place, the more predictable they became. American snipers exploited this patiently, allowing fear to build before firing again. A second shot. Another loss. Not rapid. Not chaotic. Deliberate. Japanese leaders faced a narrowing set of choices. Advance and accept casualties. Halt and surrender initiative. Withdraw and abandon ground. The jungle denied decisive action. It rewarded only patience, a quality now monopolized by the unseen enemy. Attempts to break the stalemate often ended abruptly. Units ordered to rush forward found themselves crossing open patches or narrow trails under watchful eyes. Men dropped in sequence, not because of overwhelming fire, but because movement itself revealed intent. Each step announced position. Each adjustment betrayed location. American snipers remained largely invisible. Their discipline prevented detection. Shots were taken from unexpected angles, elevated positions, oblique lines of sight, places where Japanese soldiers did not expect observation. Camouflage blended seamlessly with roots, bark, and shadow. The forest did not merely hide them, it absorbed them. The psychological breaking point came not from losses alone, but from uncertainty. Japanese soldiers could not determine where danger lay. Every direction seemed equally threatening. Even stillness felt temporary, as if safety existed only between moments. Fatigue set in. Focus deteriorated. Fear no longer surged, it lingered. As engagements dragged on, movement slowed to a crawl. Orders were delayed. Patrols hesitated before stepping into clearings. Units began operating defensively by default, reacting rather than initiating. The jungle had inverted roles. The attacker now behaved like the hunted. American forces capitalized on this without haste. Snipers coordinated with infantry, guiding advances by denying the enemy freedom of movement. When Japanese units finally withdrew, they did so under constant pressure, each retreat measured and constrained. There was no pursuit in the traditional sense. Observation followed. Control remained. What made this climax decisive was its inevitability. Japanese doctrine required movement to function. Without it, units lost cohesion and purpose. American doctrine, refined for jungle conditions, thrived on stillness. The forest became an extension of their strategy, a place where time favored the watcher, not the mover. By the end of these engagements, Japanese soldiers no longer trusted the jungle to protect them. They moved when ordered, not when confident. Fear accompanied every step. The forest that once offered concealment now imposed surveillance. And as this reality settled in, its effects extended beyond any single engagement, shaping the aftermath of jungle warfare across the Pacific. The consequences of this shift would soon be felt not just on the battlefield, but in doctrine, morale, and the course of the war itself. The immediate aftermath of jungle engagements dominated by American snipers was not measured solely in casualties. It was measured in behavior. Japanese units altered how they moved, how they paused, and how they thought about terrain they once trusted implicitly. The forest had not changed, but their relationship to it had. Field reports began to reflect a consistent pattern. Japanese patrols shortened their routes. Reconnaissance became cautious to the point of hesitation. Units delayed movement until absolutely necessary, often choosing to remain in exposed positions rather than risk advancing through cover. The jungle, once viewed as protection, was now associated with uncertainty and loss. This shift carried strategic consequences. Japanese doctrine depended on aggressive maneuver to disrupt and exhaust the enemy. When that maneuver slowed, momentum vanished. American units, by contrast, experienced greater freedom. With enemy movement constrained, supply lines stabilized. Defensive perimeters strengthened. Initiative passed quietly but decisively into American hands. American commanders recognized the significance of this psychological shift. Sniper employment expanded accordingly. More men were trained. Selection emphasized discipline over aggression. Patience over speed. The goal was not simply to increase kills, but to reinforce a condition, a constant sense of observation that denied the enemy confidence. Training programs incorporated jungle-specific lessons. Snipers learned to operate independently for extended periods. Infantry units were taught how to support overwatch without revealing positions. Doctrine evolved to emphasize denial of movement as a form of control. Fire was applied sparingly, but with purpose. Japanese attempts to counter this adaptation met limited success. Camouflage improved. Movement became slower and more deliberate. Yet these measures often compounded the problem. Slower movement increased exposure time. Hesitation created predictability. Defensive postures reduced flexibility. Each adjustment treated the symptom, not the cause. Morale suffered quietly. Fear did not manifest as panic. It manifested as caution. A reluctance to move. A reluctance to lead from the front. Officers understood that visibility equaled vulnerability. Command presence diminished. Orders traveled indirectly. Units operated with less cohesion, more fragmentation. American forces, observing these changes, adapted once more. Snipers were used to shape engagements rather than initiate them. By denying key terrain, they funneled Japanese units into disadvantageous positions. Infantry advances were timed to moments of enemy hesitation. Control replaced confrontation. The long-term impact of this dynamic extended beyond individual battles. As campaigns progressed, American jungle warfare doctrine matured into a repeatable system. Forests were no longer unpredictable obstacles. They were mapped, observed, and controlled. The same principles applied from island to island, regardless of vegetation density or climate. Japanese forces entered later engagements with diminished confidence in terrain that once favored them. The psychological advantage they had relied upon early in the war had eroded. The forest no longer felt like home ground. It felt contested, and increasingly hostile. Fear spread not through rumor, but through experience. Soldiers learned by watching. By surviving. By understanding that unseen eyes could dictate outcomes without revealing themselves. The jungle carried memory now. Certain paths were avoided. Certain clearings approached with dread. American dominance in these environments did not require overwhelming force. It required consistency, observation, discipline, the denial of freedom. By controlling movement, American forces controlled tempo, and by controlling tempo, they shaped the battlefield long after shots ceased. As this new reality settled across the Pacific, its implications reached beyond tactics and training, inviting reflection on how warfare itself had been transformed beneath the canopy. That reflection would reveal a deeper truth about dominance, environment, and the silent power of patience in modern war. The Pacific jungle did not favor strength alone. It favored understanding. What unfolded beneath its canopy was not merely a contest of weapons, but a contest of perception, of who could see without being seen, who could wait longer, and who could impose fear without revealing themselves. American dominance in jungle warfare emerged not from overwhelming force, but from restraint. By mastering observation, U.S. forces transformed the forest from an unpredictable environment into a controlled system. Movement became measurable. Patterns became readable. Time itself became a tactical asset. The jungle ceased to be a barrier and became an extension of strategy. For Japanese soldiers, this shift was profound. Terrain they once trusted no longer offered certainty. The forest no longer concealed intent. It exposed it. Confidence gave way to caution. Initiative gave way to hesitation. Fear did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated, shaped by silence and absence rather than chaos. This transformation reshaped how modern militaries understood irregular terrain. Jungle warfare was no longer defined by proximity alone, but by patience. Not by who advanced fastest, but by who could endure stillness the longest. The lessons learned in the Pacific would influence training, doctrine, and battlefield philosophy long after the war ended. American snipers did not dominate the jungle by force of numbers. They dominated it by denying freedom. By making movement dangerous and hesitation costly, they imposed control without constant engagement. It was a form of power that did not announce itself, and therefore could not easily be challenged. The legacy of this adaptation extends beyond World War II. It illustrates a timeless truth of warfare: environments do not decide outcomes on their own. Those who study them deeply, who respect their limits and exploit their patterns, ultimately shape the fight. In the dense forest shade of the Pacific, fear became a weapon not because it was inflicted loudly, but because it was sustained quietly. And in that silence, dominance was established, not by what was seen, but by what could never be seen at all.